25 years ago, Microsoft called Linux a cancer. That is not an exaggeration or a rumor. Their own CEO said it on record in an interview that is still floating around the internet today. Linux was treated like a virus that had to be stopped before it spread into businesses, into schools, into governments. Microsoft spent hundreds of millions of dollars fighting it in courtrooms and marketing campaigns and in backroom deals with hardware manufacturers. And now, in 2026, that same company is quietly turning Windows into a Linux clone, one feature at a time, and they are not even pretending otherwise anymore. If you have not been paying attention to the last few months of Windows updates, you are about to feel a little dizzy, because what used to be Microsoft's biggest enemy is now the blueprint for almost everything new coming out of Redmond. Command line tools, container systems, server operating systems, developer workstations, even the way windows are arranged on your screen, all of it is being rebuilt using ideas, code, and philosophies that came straight out of the Linux world. This is not a small trend. This is a full identity shift for the most dominant desktop operating system on the planet. Let's start with the most obvious one, because it is honestly the boldest move Microsoft has made in years. At Build 2026, the company announced something called Coreutils for Windows. If that name means nothing to you, here is the short version. Coreutils is the collection of tiny command line tools that every single Linux system in the world relies on. Things like ls to list files, cp to copy them, mv to move them, grep to search text, and find or locate files buried deep inside folders. These commands have existed on Linux and Unix systems since before most of us were born. Microsoft did not just build something similar. They took an open source project called Utils, a Rust-based rewrite of the original GNU Coreutils, and shipped it directly inside Windows. We are talking about more than 75 Unix-style commands now, running natively on a Windows machine, with zero need for a virtual machine, zero need for WSL, and zero need for some clunky third-party workaround. You install it with a single winget command, and suddenly your Windows terminal behaves like a Linux terminal. Think about how strange that sentence would have sounded a decade ago. A Windows machine running actual Linux command line tools, natively blessed and shipped by Microsoft itself. Under the hood, they even built it cleverly. Instead of creating a separate program for every single command, they made one binary called coreutils.x. And every command, like ls.x or cp.exe, is just a hard link pointing back to that same file. It is a small technical detail, but it shows how seriously they treated this project. This was not a marketing stunt. This was real engineering effort poured into making Windows feel like Linux. And here is the part that really gets me. Microsoft openly admitted why they built it. They said developers constantly move between platforms, but familiar commands do not work consistently, which forces workarounds and kills productivity. Translate that corporate language into plain English, and what they are really saying is this: Linux won the command line war so completely that Windows had to start copying its homework just to stay relevant to developers. But Coreutils is just the appetizer. The bigger, heavier move came right alongside it, and it is called WSL containers. For years, if you wanted to run Linux containers on a Windows machine, you needed Docker Desktop or Podman or some other third-party tool sitting on top of the Windows subsystem for Linux. It worked, but it always felt bolted on, like a guest that had overstayed its welcome. Now Microsoft has built container support directly into WSL itself, with its own command line tool called wslc.exe, and yes, there is even a friendly alias, so you can just type container instead if that feels more natural to you. If you have ever used Docker, this new tool is going to feel eerily familiar. Microsoft's own product manager admitted the syntax was designed to feel familiar to Docker users, which is corporate speak, for we basically copied the format everyone already knows and loves from the Linux container world. Underneath the surface, WSL containers spins up real Linux containers inside a lightweight Hyper-V virtual machine. But from the user's side, it just feels like a native command in your terminal. They did not stop at just making it work. They rebuilt the file system underneath it too, introducing something called Vertioffs, which Microsoft claims makes file access inside these containers roughly twice as fast as before. They also added a new default networking mode called Consomme, designed to fix compatibility headaches that used to plague WSL networking. For enterprise users, they even added management controls through Intune, so IT administrators can control who gets to use these Linux containers and how. And Microsoft Defender for Endpoint was updated so it can actually monitor activity happening inside these Linux containers, not just the Windows side of the machine. Let that sink in for a second. Microsoft's own security software is now being trained to watch over Linux workloads running inside Windows, because Linux containers have become such a core part of how modern software gets built, tested, and deployed. The company that once tried to bury Linux is now protecting it like a prized asset inside its own operating system. Now let's zoom out from the desktop and look at what Microsoft is doing on the server side, because this is where things get even more revealing. At the same Build 2026 event, Microsoft introduced Azure Linux 4.0, not a Windows Server update, not a Hyper-V improvement. An entirely new Microsoft-built and Microsoft-maintained Linux distribution designed to run as a general-purpose operating system across Azure virtual machines. This distribution is based on Fedora, uses the RPM package format that Linux administrators have relied on for decades, and is specifically built with a trimmed-down package set for better security and supply chain transparency. Previously, Azure Linux was mostly used as a backend for container hosting inside Azure Kubernetes Service. Now Microsoft is positioning it as a legitimate general-purpose server operating system that customers can run their actual workloads on directly, on purpose, by choice. Right alongside that announcement came Azure Container Linux, which just reached general availability as an immutable operating system built specifically to host Kubernetes clusters. Immutable is a word borrowed straight from the modern Linux world, where operating systems are designed so that the core system files cannot be casually changed or corrupted. Instead of software slowly rotting over years of updates, patches, and leftover junk files, an immutable system stays clean, predictable, and secure by design. This idea has been maturing in the Linux ecosystem for years, through projects most casual users have never even heard of. And now it is becoming a foundational pillar of Microsoft's own cloud strategy. So think about what just happened here. Microsoft now maintains not one, but two of its own Linux distributions, built in-house, running critical infrastructure across Azure. The company that spent the early 2000s treating Linux like an existential threat is now literally engineering, packaging, and shipping Linux operating systems under its own name. If you're enjoying seeing just how far this goes, hit that like button right now, because it genuinely helps this video reach more people who need to hear about this shift. There's also a detail buried inside the Caroodles announcement that most casual readers skipped right past, and it says a lot about how seriously Microsoft is treating this project. They did not just port the easy commands and call it a day, they also documented exactly which Unix tools they left out, things like chmod, chown, croot, nohup, and tty, because those commands depend on POSIX features that simply do not exist inside the Windows file system model. Commands like kill and timeout are also missing for now, since Windows does not support POSIX style signals the same way Linux does. Microsoft even said publicly that signal support might be possible down the road, which tells you this project is not finished. It is only getting started. They also published a full compatibility table explaining exactly how each command behaves differently depending on whether you are running it inside Command Prompt, PowerShell, or Windows Terminal. Because command names like ls and cat can quietly conflict with existing Windows commands depending on your system path order. That is the kind of obsessive, unglamorous engineering work that companies usually only do when they genuinely care about getting something right, not when they are just checking a marketing box. Now let's talk hardware next, because Microsoft is not just changing software anymore. They are changing what machines look like out of the box. At Build 2026, they unveiled something called the Surface RTX Spark DevBox, marketed as a high-end workstation built specifically for AI development. Here's the twist. This machine ships pre-configured with WSL2, native GPU pass-through, and full NVIDIA CUDA support baked right in from the moment you turn it on. Why does that matter so much? Because CUDA and most modern AI frameworks were built with Linux environments in mind from the very beginning. Researchers, engineers, and machine learning teams have overwhelmingly defaulted to Linux workstations for years simply because that is where the tooling worked best without friction. Instead of pretending that reality does not exist, Microsoft built a machine that leans directly into it. They're essentially saying, fine, if AI development runs best on Linux, we will make Windows the friendliest possible host for that Linux environment, right out of the box. This is a genuinely massive shift in strategy. For most of Windows history, the entire philosophy was to make everything work the Windows way, and if that clashed with how developers on other platforms operated, that was considered an acceptable trade-off. Now the philosophy has flipped. Microsoft is building hardware and software specifically to lower the friction for people who would otherwise walk away and buy a Linux workstation instead. Let's rewind for a second and talk about something people forget. Because Microsoft has actually been quietly absorbing Linux tools for years before any of this. Windows already ships with sudo, the command that lets you temporarily run something with elevated permissions, a concept that has been core to Linux and Unix security models since the very beginning. Windows also already ships with curl for transferring data from servers, and tar for compressing and archiving files, both tools that originated deep inside the Unix and Linux world decades ago. None of these were flashy announcements when they first landed. They just quietly appeared in Windows updates, almost like Microsoft hoped nobody would connect the dots. But once you start noticing the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Sudo, curl, tar, and now an entire suite of caroodles, all living inside the operating system that used to market itself as the anti-Linux. And this pattern did not start in 2026, it just accelerated dramatically this year. Go back further and you will find Microsoft joining the Linux Foundation as a platinum member, something that would have been unthinkable. During the Ballmer era, you will find Microsoft becoming one of the largest corporate contributors to the Linux kernel itself, writing actual code that ships inside the very operating system they once tried to destroy. You will find them open sourcing .NET, open sourcing PowerShell, and making Visual Studio Code, arguably the most popular code editor on the planet right now, run natively on Linux, Windows, and Mac OS with almost identical functionality across all three. Even GitHub, a company built almost entirely around open source collaboration, is owned by Microsoft now, which still feels strange to say out loud if you remember the company's reputation from 20 years ago. Every one of these moves quietly built the foundation for what we are watching happen in 2026. This is not a sudden pivot. This is the visible result of a strategy that has been unfolding patiently for over a decade. And this year is simply the moment it became impossible to ignore. Now let's talk about something a little more visual, something you have probably felt frustrated about, even if you never knew the reason why. Window management. If you have ever used Windows 11's snap layouts, you know the drill. You hover over the Maximize button, pick a layout, and Windows arranges your current window into a zone. It sounds convenient until you open a second window, and a third, and a fourth. And suddenly you're back to manually dragging things around just like it was 2009. Again, Linux users have had a radically different solution for years called tiling window management. Instead of windows floating around like sticky notes that you constantly drag and resize, a tiling window manager automatically slices your screen and places every new window into a clean, non-overlapping section. No hunting for a hidden terminal window, no manual resizing. Everything is controlled by the keyboard, which sounds small until you actually try it and realize how much faster your whole workflow becomes. Windows never built this natively, but here's the fascinating part. An entire ecosystem of community tools has sprung up specifically to bring this Linux-style tiling experience to Windows machines because so many users were desperate for it. Tools like Komorebi, Glazed WM, Fancy WM, and Sealin UI are explicitly inspired by legendary Linux window managers like i3, DWM, and BSPWM. Glazed WM is even configured using a single YAML file, the exact same approach favored by Linux power users for years. People are installing these tools in huge numbers because Windows still has not caught up to what Linux desktop environments figured out a long time ago. This tells you something important. Even when Microsoft has not officially copied a feature yet, the demand from users is so loud that third-party developers are doing it for them, filling gaps that should have been addressed natively years ago. It would honestly not be surprising if a native Windows tiling mode showed up in an update within the next year or two, because the writing is already on the wall. Let's also talk about something Microsoft has not fully shipped yet, but is openly signaled, is coming. And that is the idea of an immutable Windows. Right now, Windows installations slowly accumulate junk over the years. Broken registry entries pile up, leftover files from uninstalled programs sit around forever, inconsistent software remnants scatter across your system drive until eventually the whole machine feels sluggish and unpredictable, and most people just accept that as the cost of using a computer for a long time. Linux solved this problem years ago through immutable distributions, where the core operating system files are locked down and cannot be casually modified, while your personal data and applications stay flexible on top of that stable foundation. Updates get applied as complete, atomic snapshots instead of messy incremental patches, which means your system either updates cleanly or rolls back cleanly with no in-between broken state. Microsoft already brought this exact philosophy to Azure Container Linux, treating it as an immutable host operating system for Kubernetes. The obvious next question is when, not if, that same philosophy makes its way down into consumer Windows itself. Given how aggressively Microsoft has been borrowing Linux concepts throughout 2026, it would be genuinely surprising if an immutable version of Windows was not sitting somewhere on an internal roadmap right now, waiting for the right moment to be announced. There is one more Linux idea worth mentioning here, something a lot of Windows users do not even realize is possible until they see it happen. On Linux, you can boot an entire fully functional desktop operating system directly from a simple USB drive without installing a single file onto the actual computer. Plug it in, boot from it, use a complete operating system, and when you are done, just remove the drive. And the host machine is exactly as it was before, untouched. Anyone who has tried to replicate that same experience on Windows knows how painful it usually is, often requiring specialized enterprise tools, complicated imaging software, or workarounds that only partially work depending on the hardware involved. It remains one of the clearest examples of an area where Linux still has a meaningful lead, and it would not be shocking to see Microsoft attempt some kind of portable Windows to Go revival built around these same lightweight, disposable principles, especially now that the company is moving so aggressively in this general direction. Package management is another quiet battlefield where Linux has been winning for decades. On most Linux distributions, installing, updating, and removing software all happens through a single unified system. One command, one centralized repository, consistent behavior every single time. Windows, on the other hand, has always felt fragmented. Some apps update themselves quietly through the Microsoft Store. Others launch their own background updaters. Others require you to manually download an installer from a website and reboot your entire machine just to finish. Microsoft has been trying to fix this with the Windows Package Manager, known as Winget, which genuinely has improved things over the last few years. But even now, it often feels like something layered on top of Windows, rather than something baked deeply into its core, the way package managers are on Linux distributions like Ubuntu, Fedora, or Arch. The gap has narrowed, but anyone who has used both systems back to back can immediately feel the difference in polish and consistency. The reaction from the developer community has been split in a genuinely interesting way, and it tells you a lot about how deep this rivalry actually ran for so many years. Some longtime Linux users see all of this as a kind of quiet vindication, proof that the philosophy they believed in for decades, open tooling, transparent development, and community-driven software, was right all along, and that even the biggest company in the industry eventually had no choice but to admit it. Other longtime Linux users feel a strange discomfort watching a corporation that once fought so hard against their community now profit directly from absorbing its ideas, repackaging them, and shipping them under a Microsoft label without always crediting the smaller open source maintainers whose work made all of it possible in the first place. Meanwhile, plenty of Windows-only users are simply thrilled because they get real developer tooling without ever needing to leave the operating system they already know. They do not care about decades-old rivalries or old grudges from forum wars that happened before some of them were even using computers. They just want their commands to work the same way across every machine they touch, and right now Microsoft is delivering exactly that, faster than almost anyone expected a few years ago. There is also a smaller but genuinely clever announcement from Build 2026 worth mentioning, something called Intelligent Terminal. Instead of copying an error message out of your terminal, pasting it into a browser, and hunting for a fix on some forum, Microsoft built a version of the Windows terminal that connects directly to AI agents like GitHub Copilot. You get context-aware help without ever leaving the command line. Interestingly, rather than merging this into the main Windows terminal everyone already uses, Microsoft forked it into a separate build entirely, seemingly to avoid another wave of backlash around AI features being forced onto people who never asked for them. There's another small but telling announcement worth mentioning here, called Windows Developer Configurations. The basic idea is simple. Instead of manually installing a dozen different tools every single time you set up a new development machine, you define your entire setup once in a configuration file, and Windows handles the rest automatically. If that concept sounds familiar, it should, because it is essentially the same philosophy behind Linux files and infrastructure as code tools that developers on Linux and Mac OS have used for years to keep their environments consistent across multiple machines. Windows is once again playing catch-up to a workflow that Linux users have quietly enjoyed for a very long time. It is also worth pointing out just how different Microsoft's public tone has become around all of this. In the past, whenever Windows borrowed something from the open source world, the company tended to stay quiet about where the idea actually came from, almost like acknowledging Linux directly might feel like admitting defeat. That has completely changed. Microsoft's own engineers now openly reference Docker when describing WSL containers. They openly credit the utils open source project when describing core utils. They openly describe Azure Linux as Fedora derived. There is no more hiding the influence, no more vague marketing language designed to obscure where these ideas actually originated. They are naming names, crediting projects, and building directly on top of open source foundations in full public view. That shift in tone matters just as much as the technical changes themselves. It signals a company that has stopped worrying about looking weak for admitting Linux got something right first. Instead, Microsoft appears to have realized that developers respect honesty and genuine interoperability far more than they respect a walled garden that pretends to have invented everything internally. And in a job market where developers can choose their tools freely, that kind of trust is worth more than any amount of clever marketing copy. Now step back and look at the entire picture forming here. Command line tools borrowed from Linux, a native container system built to feel exactly like Docker, to entire Linux distributions built and maintained in-house for Azure, developer hardware pre-configured around WSL and CUDA, community tools recreating Linux-style window tiling because official Windows tools still cannot match it. VA package manager slowly evolving to feel more like apt or Pac-Man. This is not a coincidence, and it is definitely not a one-time trend that will fade away next quarter. This is a company that has fully, quietly, and permanently accepted that Linux won the developer world, not Windows, not macOS, Linux. Cloud infrastructure runs on it. Container ecosystems are built around it. AI and machine learning frameworks assume it as the default environment. And instead of continuing to fight that reality the way Microsoft did in the 90s and the 2000s, they have made the strategic decision to simply absorb it, piece by piece, feature by feature, until using Windows starts to feel less like using Windows and more like using a very polished, very corporate flavor of Linux with a familiar desktop wrapped around it. Some of you watching this probably switched to Linux years ago because Windows could not offer what you needed as a developer. And now you're watching Microsoft scramble to rebuild the exact environment you already had for free, just with a Microsoft logo stamped on top of it. Others of you are still on Windows, and honestly, this is genuinely good news for you. You are getting real Linux tooling, real container support, and real developer-friendly infrastructure without ever needing to dual boot or wrestle with a separate operating system. But here is the real question worth sitting with. If Microsoft keeps absorbing Linux features at this pace, year after year, release after release, what actually makes Windows different from Linux 5 years from now? Is Windows becoming Linux with extra steps, extra licensing costs, and a start menu bolted on top? Or is Microsoft simply building the most convenient on-ramp into the Linux ecosystem that has ever existed? Wrapped inside an operating system hundreds of millions of people already know how to use? Think about it from a purely business-focused angle for a moment, because that actually explains a lot of this shift better than nostalgia or rivalry ever could. Cloud computing runs overwhelmingly on Linux servers today, and Microsoft's own Azure platform depends heavily on customers who are already comfortable inside Linux environments. If Microsoft forces every single one of those customers to learn a completely different Windows-only way of doing things, some meaningful percentage of them simply walk away to a competitor that speaks their language natively. By building genuine native Linux compatibility directly into Windows and Azure, Microsoft removes that friction entirely and keeps developers and their money firmly inside the Microsoft ecosystem instead of losing them to a rival cloud provider. That is really the quiet engine driving almost everything we have talked about in this video. This was never really about suddenly falling in love with open source out of nowhere. It is about recognizing very clearly where the actual money and the actual talent pool are heading, and building the fastest possible bridge to meet them there before a competitor builds that bridge first. Amazon and Google have both been investing heavily in Linux native cloud tooling for years, and Microsoft cannot afford to look outdated or unfriendly to developers in a market that is this competitive and this fast-moving. There is no clean answer yet, and honestly, that is what makes this such a fascinating moment to be watching closely. The company that once called Linux a cancer is now one of the largest contributors to open source software on the planet. The operating system that once tried to lock developers into a closed ecosystem is now shipping native support for tools built entirely outside its walls. History does not usually turn this far in the opposite direction, and yet here we are, watching it happen in real time, one build conference at a time. If this kind of deep dive into where tech is actually heading is something you want more of, go ahead and subscribe, because there is a lot more of this coming, and you do not want to miss the next piece of this story. So where does this leave things for the average person just trying to get work done on their computer? Honestly, in a pretty great position. You do not need to choose a side anymore between Windows and Linux the way people did a decade ago. You can install core utils and run familiar commands natively. You can spin up Linux containers without touching a third-party tool. You can build AI projects on hardware that assumes you will be living inside WSL most of the day. And if you want that clean, keyboard-driven tiling window experience that Linux users have loved for years, there is now a thriving ecosystem of tools ready to bring that exact feel to your Windows desktop. What used to require dual booting, or running a completely separate machine, or fighting with virtual machines just to get a taste of the Linux workflow, is now becoming a built-in first-class experience inside the operating system most of the world already uses every single day. Whether you love that shift or find it a little unsettling probably depends on how long you have been watching this rivalry play out, and honestly, how much of your own workflow is built around one side winning over the other. If you are a developer who has spent years switching between a Windows laptop for work and a Linux server for deployment, this whole shift genuinely makes your daily life easier, even if the history behind it feels a little ironic. And if you are someone who has stayed loyal to Linux on the desktop specifically, because Windows never respected the way you wanted to work, it is worth watching closely whether Microsoft's version of these features ever truly matches the flexibility, transparency, and control that made you choose Linux in the first place. Borrowing the tools is one thing. Borrowing the philosophy behind them is a much harder thing to fake. And if you think about where this leaves smaller operating systems and smaller open source projects, it is a genuinely mixed bag too. On one hand, projects like Utils, the small Rust-based team behind the core Utils, rewrite that Microsoft now ships inside Windows, suddenly get an enormous wave of visibility and real-world testing that they never could have achieved on their own. Millions of Windows machines are now quietly running code maintained by a comparatively small open source community, which is a huge validation for the people who built it. On the other hand, there's a legitimate conversation happening right now about whether massive companies like Microsoft give enough back in funding, in credit, and in long-term support to the small teams whose work quietly powers so much of this shift. That tension is not going away anytime soon, and it is worth keeping in mind the next time you see a shiny new Microsoft announcement. That sounds suspiciously familiar if you have spent any real time inside a Linux terminal. Behind almost every one of these features sits a smaller project, often maintained by volunteers, that did the hard, unglamorous work first, long before it ever showed up polished and rebranded inside a Build conference keynote. Either way, one thing is undeniable. The walls between these two worlds are dissolving faster than almost anyone predicted. And Microsoft is not just tolerating that shift anymore, they are actively engineering it, feature after feature, conference after conference, month after month. The cancer comment feels like it happened in a different universe at this point. Because right now, in 2026, Microsoft is not fighting Linux at all. They are becoming it one command, one container, and one operating system release at a time.